The wedding dress weighed more than she did, not because it was lavish, though it was. Gold embroidery, velvet sleeves, a fur-trimmed collar sewn stiff to hide the bruising. But because she was 6 years old, a child trying to carry the weight of an empire stitched into her tiny bones. The church bells rang anyway, because to the crown her size didn't matter, her age didn't matter. Her voice, her fear, her future, all irrelevant. What mattered was her bloodline. What mattered was that she was a pawn on a chessboard, and today she would be married off to a man old enough to be her father. A king, 29 years old, who had already fought wars, buried wives, and written treaties. He needed an alliance. She had the right name. She was 6. And this was England, 1290. The girl's name was Isabella of France. Born in Paris to King Philip IV, sometimes known as Philip the Fair, which had nothing to do with fairness. He was tall, cruel, and obsessed with control. His daughter, his only one, was never a daughter in the emotional sense. She was a bargaining chip from the moment she took her first breath. The man she was sold to? Edward II of England, a king whose reign would become infamous for weakness, betrayal, and one very particular scandal we'll get to later. But in 1290 he was still just Prince Edward, ambitious, calculating, already surrounded by men who whispered in his ear and eyed the French court with suspicion. The match was political. Of course it was, because medieval marriage wasn't about love. It wasn't even about companionship. It was about claim, to land, to titles, to safety. And a royal bride was less a wife and more a human treaty. One letter from the English Chancellor put it plainly. The union of the Lady Isabella with our Lord Edward shall cement the peace of Christendom and silence the threats of France. Peace of Christendom, a noble goal, bought with a 6-year-old's body. Now technically, the church forbade marriages before the age of 7. That was the canonical age of consent. But this was royalty, and royal exceptions were always made, especially when it served kings. So the betrothal was declared when Isabella was just 4 years old, sealed with a treaty and a bridal promise. Her dowry included castles, a strategic port, and over 18,000 gold florins. Her husband-to-be got land. Her father got power. And Isabella? She got a future carved in stone before she learned how to read. The marriage wouldn't be consummated until later, of course. That's what the scribes always note, as if that changes the horror. The marriage was not immediately physical, they write. The bride was respected. But let's be clear, Isabella was handed over at age 12, and not consummated immediately is not the same thing as not prepared for. Her household was rearranged, her tutors replaced, her nurses instructed to prepare her body. A letter from her governess, preserved in the French Royal Archives, says, "She is quiet, she obeys. She has stopped asking questions." Because by 10, Isabella had already been told what her duty was. To please a man, to carry an heir, to stand silent and regal while men shouted over her crown, and if she refused, that wasn't an option. When she finally crossed the channel into England, the crowds cheered. Not for her beauty, not for her youth, but because she represented peace, a pause in the endless Anglo-French wars, a symbol that the two royal lines had joined, and a symbol once unveiled is no longer a person. One chronicler wrote, "She was small but composed. She did not cry." Of course she didn't cry. She'd been trained not to. Her chambers were cold. The English court was unfamiliar. Her husband, now crowned Edward II, was distant, distracted. He barely spoke to her, because Edward wasn't interested in his wife. He was interested in Piers Gaveston. Ah yes, the lover. The man who would become one of the most infamous figures in English royal history. A knight of lower nobility, handsome, daring, and utterly inseparable from Edward. They ate together, slept nearby, laughed in court while Isabella sat alone. Edward gave him lands, jewels, even the wedding gifts meant for Isabella herself. And the child bride? She waited in the stone walls of Westminster Palace, surrounded by spies, watched by servants. A 12-year-old girl lay in a velvet bed, while her husband cavorted with his male favorite and ignored her completely. This wasn't just betrayal, it was humiliation. So when did the consummation happen? That's the question scholars debate. Official records suggest Isabella gave birth at age 16, which means the act itself, what they so politely call consummation, likely happened around 14 or 15. But remember, by then, she had been in England for years, alone, under constant pressure to conceive. Letters between French diplomats mentioned concern over her failure to quicken, a euphemism for pregnancy. One noted, "The Lady Queen is obedient, but there is no issue yet. The court wonders." They wondered. She bled, and eventually, she bore a child. That child would become Edward III, one of England's most powerful kings, but for now, he was just proof that the bride had done her duty. The child bride. The foreign girl, the girl who was handed across the sea like a diplomatic scroll. She gave England its heir, she did what she was told, and no one clapped for her. They clapped for the king, because the child bride's purpose was complete. She had given him a son, and still, he would not look at her. By the time Queen Isabella was 16, she had done everything her role demanded. She had married the king, she had moved to a foreign court, she had endured the cold, damp chambers of Westminster, the humiliation of being ignored, and the pressure of an entire nation waiting for her belly to swell. And it finally had. The baby, Edward III, was born in 1312, a future warrior king, for now just a red-faced infant in cloth diapers. The kingdom rejoiced. But Edward II barely noticed, because his heart, and most of his attention, still belonged to Piers Gaveston, the man whose very name had become a scandal across Europe. And Isabella? She was tired of being second. Gaveston was everything a medieval noble hated in a royal favorite. He was low-born in aristocratic terms, arrogant and worse, unapologetically intimate with the king. While Isabella gave birth, Gaveston slept in royal chambers, while courtiers whispered about the queen. The king threw feasts for his favorite, paraded him through the streets in French silks, and even called him my brother, my companion, my dear friend, which in 14th century political language was basically announcing, "This man matters more than my wife." Foreign dignitaries were shocked. French ambassadors sent urgent letters back to Paris. One surviving report reads, "Her Majesty is sidelined. The favorite is bold and insolent. The Queen has been robbed of her wedding gifts and dignity, because yes, Edward gave Piers the wedding jewels meant for Isabella, gave him lands, castles, and titles, called him Earl of Cornwall, a title traditionally reserved for royal blood." Isabella was humiliated, again, and yet, she waited. She smiled. Because she had learned one thing by now: watch first, strike later. The barons didn't wait so long. Edward's obsession with Gaveston, and his blatant disregard for Isabella, was now a national crisis. Nobles were furious, Parliament was restless, and the people, always watching from the mud and gutters, began calling Gaveston a curse on the crown. In 1312, the anger boiled over. A group of nobles led by the Earl of Lancaster cornered Gaveston near Warwick, dragged him from sanctuary, and executed him without trial. They stabbed him through the chest and left his body by the roadside. The king was inconsolable. He wore mourning black for months, refused to eat, locked himself in his chambers. And Isabella? She didn't shed a tear. She sat in court, regal and composed. The slight smile on her lips didn't make it into the official chronicles, but it was there, because Gaveston was gone, and now she had her chance. But power in a medieval court doesn't just transfer, it has to be taken. And Isabella had a problem. Her husband wasn't just incompetent, he was persistent. After Gaveston's death, Edward attached himself to another pair of men, Hugh Despencer the elder, and Hugh Despencer the younger. A father-son duo known for greed, cruelty, and the uncanny ability to flatter the king while robbing the kingdom. And once again, Isabella was pushed aside. The Despensers took her lands, removed her allies, seized gifts given by her father. One record from the royal wardrobe notes, 2 brooches of French design were transferred to the chamber of Lord Despencer. They were hers, now they were his. And when Isabella protested, the king told her to be silent. But Isabella was no longer a child. She had grown up in a court of strategy. She had studied the power games of her father, Philip IV, the man who destroyed the Knights Templar, executed dozens of nobles, and manipulated the church into electing a French pope. She had learned, and now she began to build her own web. Carefully, quietly, gathering allies, she befriended discontented barons. She made polite visits to nobles whose sons had been imprisoned. She wrote letters, hidden, coded, smuggled back to France. And most importantly, she waited, because a queen in a crown may be powerless. But a mother? A mother with a male heir? She was dangerous. Edward, meanwhile, became increasingly paranoid. He ordered executions of nobles who spoke against him. He let the dispensers rule unchecked, bleeding the treasury dry. One chronicler noted, "The king grows thinner and his crown heavier. His enemies multiply faster than his food." England was unraveling, and Isabella saw her moment. In 1325, Edward sent her to France on a diplomatic mission. It was meant to be temporary. She was to negotiate with her brother, King Charles IV, on Edward's behalf. Smile, bow, return. But she didn't return, she stayed. And in Paris, she met a man. His name was Roger Mortimer, an English noble who had fled to France after escaping the Tower of London. Charismatic, cunning, and a sworn enemy of the dispensers. And soon, Isabella's letters changed tone. One noted, "The queen no longer writes with patience. Her words are sharpened." Because now she had something more than fury. She had a plan. Together, she and Mortimer raised an army. Backed by French funds and disaffected English lords, they prepared to invade England. Not to challenge the crown, to remove it. In 1326, they landed on the coast with a small force, just a few hundred men at first. But the country was ready, nobles defected, towns opened their gates. The people, tired of famine, taxes, and humiliation, cheered the queen's arrival. Edward II fled. The dispensers were captured. Hugh Despenser the Younger was given no trial. He was tied to a ladder, stripped and castrated in public. His genitals burned before his eyes. Then he was hanged, drawn, and quartered. The crowd applauded. Isabella watched from a platform, face calm, expression unreadable. Edward II was imprisoned, his crown taken, and his son, Isabella's son, was declared king at just 14. Queen Isabella had done the impossible. The child bride, the pawn, the foreign girl. She had overthrown a king, without a sword, without a throne, just with her silence, her patience, and the cold fury of someone who had been ignored too long. For the first time in her life, Isabella was free, not just from her husband, but from the silence. From the gaze of courtiers who saw only a womb. From the gilded cage of diplomacy, where her value was measured in treaties and bloodlines. She was no longer a child bride. She was regent of England. In name, the new king was Edward III, her son just 14 years old. But in practice, it was Isabella who ruled. She issued royal orders, held court, reviewed petitions. She signed letters with her full title, Isabella, by the grace of God, Queen of England, Lady of Ireland, and Regent of the realm. And she did not rule alone. At her side was Roger Mortimer, now the de facto co-ruler of England. Their partnership was political, romantic, and increasingly unpopular, because while the Queen had been adored as the savior who overthrew a tyrant, public affection has a short memory, and power, as always, changes the story. Within a year of Edward II's fall, England began to murmur. The economy hadn't improved. Taxation remained heavy, and Mortimer, who now called himself Earl of March, began behaving like a king in all but name. He wore royal robes, carried a scepter, and according to First Chronicler, he kissed the queen's cheek in full view of the court. That was a problem, because in medieval England, a queen's power came from her purity, her status as wife and mother. To rule beside a lover was not only a scandal, it was treasonous optics. And for all her cunning, Isabella had made one mistake. She had replaced her husband. She hadn't destroyed the patriarchy. She'd just picked a new man to share the throne. And what of Edward II? The deposed king was still alive, barely. Held under house arrest in Berkeley Castle, isolated and humiliated, he remained a threat so long as he drew breath. Rebellion still claimed his name. Clergy whispered that a king chosen by God could not be unseated by mortal hands. And so, in September 1327, something happened. Something never officially recorded, but widely understood. A letter from an Italian merchant reads, "The former king has died, they say of fever, but no one is allowed near the body. The official version, natural causes. The rumors, that he was murdered by hot iron, inserted into the one part of the body that would leave no visible wound. The chroniclers hesitated, but the image stuck. A king screaming into a stone pillow as his body was destroyed from within. And outside, Isabella said nothing. If she had once been the bride in a dress too heavy for her, now she was the woman who wore a crown that weighed more than anyone imagined. At first, she carried it well. She reformed trade tariffs, restored certain barons to power, paid off debts incurred under Edward II. But Mortimer grew bold, too bold. He demanded ever larger titles, began building a fortress in Wales, held private courts, arrested nobles without trial. He even ordered the execution of Edmund of Kent, the late king's brother, claiming Edmund plotted to free Edward II. But Edward II was already dead, which meant the execution was not just brutal, it was fraudulent, and England began to seethe. The Queen Regent was losing her grip, and her son, the boy king, was watching. Edward III had grown tall, quiet, and sharp-eyed. He listened, he learned, and he began to understand that he was king only in name. The real power sat in his mother's chambers, slept beside Mortimer, wrote laws without his signature. He was being humiliated, just as she once had been. And so, in 1330, he made a choice. He gathered loyal men in the dead of night, snuck into Nottingham Castle, where Mortimer and Isabella slept. The doors were barred, guards bribed, the Queen's chambers locked. But the young king forced his way in. Mortimer was seized, tried, and executed within weeks, hanged like a common thief, stripped of his titles, his lands, his name. Isabella was arrested, but not killed, perhaps out of mercy, perhaps out of caution. Instead, she was confined to Castle Rising, a cold estate in Norfolk. She wasn't imprisoned exactly, but she wasn't free either. And there, behind high walls and guarded gates, the former queen faded from view. No more courts, no more orders, just her memories. So what kind of ending is this? Not a clean one. Because Isabella, for all her strength, never quite escaped the contradictions she lived inside. She'd been married as a child, treated as an object, betrayed by her husband. She had endured, she had overthrown him, ruled a nation, written laws, and in the end she was discarded by her son. Like her power had been borrowed, never owned. A temporary anomaly in a system built for men. In her final years, Isabella turned to religion. She wore nuns' habits, donated to abbeys, spent hours in chapel. Some say she went mad, others say she simply withdrew. But she lived to see her son become one of England's most celebrated kings. She lived to see him rule with the strength and decisiveness she once showed. And when she died in 1358, her request was simple, that she be buried with the heart of her husband, Edward II, laid gently on her chest. The man she had overthrown, the man she had possibly murdered. When Isabella died, there were no crowds, no golden procession, no public mourning, no weeping nobles lining the roads. Just a quiet burial at the Franciscan Abbey of Greyfriars in London, in a plain tomb beside a chapel wall. But beneath her folded hands, inside her burial shroud, was something peculiar, a lead casket containing the heart of Edward II. Not a symbol of love, a symbol of power, of survival, of the long, bitter game she played, and won. Because Isabella's life wasn't a romance. It wasn't a tragedy either. It was something far more uncomfortable. It was a story about what happens when a little girl, dressed in velvet and given away like livestock, learns that silence can be a weapon, that obedience can be temporary, and that waiting, if done patiently enough, can be its own kind of rebellion. Let's not pretend she was a hero. She didn't free the peasants. She didn't end suffering. Her rise to power was built on betrayal, executions, and deals made in back rooms. But she was never meant to rise at all. She was meant to marry at 6, meant to birth sons, bow to her husband, and disappear quietly behind the throne. She was supposed to be graceful, grateful, and silent. Instead, she started a war, and the records tried to erase her. The medieval chroniclers called her the she-wolf of France, not out of respect, but contempt. A woman who ruled? A woman who dared to punish her king? She must be unnatural, dangerous, a threat to the order of things. Because in medieval Europe there were only two kinds of powerful women, saints or monsters, and Isabella was too clever for sainthood. So they called her Wolf. But even that insult gives her too much credit, because Isabella wasn't savage, she wasn't wild, she was patient. She was what happens when a child bride survives long enough to understand how the game is played, and long enough to play it better. Look again at the story. A 6-year-old girl promised to a king she'd never met, married at 12, pregnant by 14, watching from the shadows as her husband flaunted his lover, stripped of land, dignity, and voice. And then, she waited, not for rescue, for the right moment. And when it came, she didn't scream, she didn't beg, she didn't demand justice, she simply took it. Quietly, efficiently, irrevocably. That's not villainy, that's survival. Today, her tomb lies mostly forgotten. A worn stone beneath layers of dust, her name fading into the cracks. But her story, it lingers. In the way history still hesitates to call a woman powerful without calling her cold. In the way little girls are still taught to be sweet before they are taught to be smart. In the way we excuse kings for cruelty and blame queens for ambition. Isabella lived all of that, and beat it anyway. So remember her, not as a bride, not as a queen, but as a girl who was sold at 6, and still found a way to write her own ending.